On this episode of the Naturist Living Show, a brief history of nakedness.
This episode of the Naturist Living Show is brought to you by Bare Oaks Family Naturist Park. At Bare Oaks, we offer traditional naturist values in a modern setting. Free your body, free your mind. www.bareoaks.ca.
Welcome, dear listeners, to episode number 37 of the Naturist Living Show. My name is Stéphane Deschênes. I am your host for this podcast, of course, and I'm also the owner of Bare Oaks Family Naturist Park. And if you've been listening for a long time or you've caught up to the shows, you know that I'm a big fan of history. I think our history is interesting in naturism. We've basically been around for about 100 years now, a century of thinking and growing and changing. And as you know, I'm not shy to be a critic of some of the things that we've done and changed into. And I'm a strong believer that naturism is a philosophy, not just taking your clothes off, of course. So sometimes I like to go back, and I went back and I got myself a few of the early books from the late 1920s and early 1930s. And I've read a few of them, and they were very interesting. Among the Nudists by Francis and Mason Merrill, published in 1931 or 32. I'd have to look it up. Don't have it in front of me. At any rate, I actually got an original copy. This book and a few of the others that were published at the time were really key in spreading the message. In a time where, there was some radio, of course, being listened to, certainly no television, absolutely no internet. Communication was challenging. Books were very, very influential. They still are today. But back then, they were even more important because they were really the only repositories of knowledge that people referred to. And reading this book was really interesting for a number of reasons. You realize that in some ways we are very similar still today, and we haven't changed that much. And in some ways, things have changed tremendously. Some of the more interesting things were they're talking about the trip from New York City to England and then Germany, where they learn about naturism and nudism. And of course, they start by taking a ship. When you think about it, in that time, 1929, I think is when they went across, they had no other option. There were no planes. There were some planes, but certainly you couldn't cross the Atlantic with them. It was before World War II. In the rural areas where naturist clubs were located, there weren't really any cars or motorized vehicles that would go out there. You had to take a horse and buggy to get there. And then when you went to local establishments like restaurants, many of them didn't have electricity in the country. So it was interesting because they don't say this to be ironic, because at the time it was the way it was. It was fact. It wasn't ironic. It wasn't with the eye of what it was going to sound like in the future, because they had no idea what the future would be like. But one of the things they seemed to be certain about is that the future would involve all of us being nude. And there is the naturism, and the nudity was very important. There was a book that came out around that time as well, which they quote from, by John Langdon-Davies, who's a quite well-known British author. And he had written a book called The Future of Nakedness. And it's all about how he actually believed that in the future everyone would be nude. That would be the way to be, because they had just discovered that you could treat a lot of illnesses like tuberculosis by sun exposure. And the sun exposure had to be nude. And it's true, a lot of, before antibiotics, this was before antibiotics were known and used, they found that you could cure this terrible disease simply by being in the sun. And you've got to imagine, at that time, that seemed miraculous. And that clearly sun and air and exposure of the body was really important to health. And so John Langdon-Davies actually imagines that in the near future, we will be all nude on a regular basis. So it isn't just a matter of something to do because they felt like it, because it feels freeing, because it feels nice. They really thought it was key to the advancement of society. And so when they go and discover, going back to Francis and Mason Merrill, when they go and discover these Naturist Club, it is with the belief that this is the future for the world and that there will be that kind of growth. Of course, we know now that that didn't happen. We know, though, that the sun, while forgotten for a while, is coming back as an important health factor, that the natural way is important to keep us strong, that modern medicine can help, but to stay healthy, you need nature. You need to be true to who we are and make sure that our body gets what it needs and what it's designed for. So it was a fun book to read, and I really realized that Naturism from the very beginning was a true philosophy. I mean, of course, it was extremely strong as a health philosophy. In fact, it wasn't much more than a health philosophy too, which is interesting. So that part also evolved. At the time, it was all about health. It was about nutrition. Many times it was vegetarian only. It was no smoking, no alcohol. Exercise regimens were really key, daily exercise. Of course, that's good too, and we know that as well. So Naturism really was a very important health concept for them. The idea that it was also about respect for self and others, I think, came later. Now it's also part of life philosophy of Naturism. Because we've thought the whole thing through, we recognize a few more things. Just like, at the time, also reading John Langdon-Davies' book, it's shockingly racist and anti-Semitic. But of course, we have to judge him in the context of the time. Everybody was racist. But some of the comments where he actually openly discusses the idea that the white people are the superior race, as proven scientifically, is almost comical to read, because we know that to be so ridiculous. So the philosophy of respect for self and others, and how that fits into clothing, and how clothing is actually oppressive in terms of making people feel bad about themselves, is something that came later, but something that came with our analyzing and understanding better what it meant to be nude amongst others and with others. And even back in the early 30s in these books, you do get that sense that there's more to it. And even going back to that book in the 30s, they're already discussing, though, the difference between nudism and naturism. That far back, nearly 100 years ago, nudism was simply being nude, whereas naturism was a much more holistic philosophy. In some ways, they talk about nudism being the health cure, and naturism already being more of a philosophy about getting closer to nature and living a more natural way, and with that, a different relationship that people have to each other and to their bodies, but not quite to the same level that we've discovered now. But again, what was getting people excited and interested is that it wasn't just about not wearing clothes. Behind, whether it was nudism or naturism, behind it was a strong philosophy. And that's what attracted people to the movement. And that is what still rings true today. I see it at Bare Oaks as we grow. I see the young people that come, the new people that come, who have never tried naturism, and it happens. We get it so often, all summer long. There were weekends where we were doing 9, 10 tours per day on Saturday and on Sunday of couples and families who had never tried naturism before and were there to discover it. But they were looking for more than just taking their clothes off. They were looking for a better way. They were looking for a philosophy, which, of course, we're not shy to talk about and to promote and to say that that's what we are. So if you have a chance, you can buy these books still relatively inexpensively, even though they're almost 100 years old. If you go online, there's a number of online resources, Abe Books and Alibris, where you can look for some of these books and buy them for $20, $30 and have them shipped to you. And it's an interesting read. I think we should all understand our history, where we've been and where we've gone from there, and what did we lose that we should have lost, and what did we lose that we should have kept, and what are we missing now that maybe we should go back to a little bit. Now, there is also modern history in terms of a modern history book that I wanted to talk about. There's an interesting book which we carry at the Bear Boutique at Bear Oaks, which is the retail outlet at Bear Oaks, and as well as an online store. And it's called A Brief History of Nakedness. And I was fascinated to read this because when you read it, it's written by a gentleman named Philip Carr-Gomm in the UK, who's also into Druidry, and he writes this book from a slightly different standpoint. He became a naturist, but he wasn't. He was interested in all kinds of other spiritual movements and ideas, which is why he became a Druid. And the idea of naturism fit in well with a lot of those thoughts and his spirituality. And so in writing this book, he puts a lot of emphasis on nudity in religion, and how most religion have nudity as part of the religion, at least in the past, if they don't today. And he connects a lot of issues with our body and protests and popular culture, and how it's in some ways it's more accepted today than it used to be, but in some other ways it's more shameful than it ever was. How it's used in politics, how it's used for protest. It's a very interesting way because, they say, it surveys the touching and sometimes tragic and often bizarre story of our relationship to our naked bodies. And as we've talked many times, as a society, we are quite warped. So it's not a book about naturism, but it's a book which clearly rings very, very true to us naturists. It's very well written, well researched, and so I wanted to find out a little bit more about the author and try to better understand how he came to write this book and how he came to become a naturist. So I gave him a call. Very nice to meet you.
It's great to talk to you too.
I read your book and I really enjoyed it. It was it was a really nice overall history, I guess, as the title suggests, a brief history of nakedness, not going into too much depth about any area, but touching on a lot of them. How did you come to write this book?
Well, I think it was really when I was researching the biography of my spiritual teacher. When I was young, I studied Druidism with the old chief Druid in England, and later, when I was 49 years old, I decided to write his biography. He died way back in 1975. And so about 10 years ago, I was writing his biography. And in his will, I discovered that he'd left a wooden chalet in a place called Spielplatz in Hertfordshire. And I didn't know what that place was. So I rang them up. I found them in the telephone directory. I rang them up, discovered they were a naturist resort. Somebody told me just before I rang them up. And so I rang them up, and I was invited to visit them on the hottest day of the year, 10 years ago. I arrived in this wonderful, idyllic setting on a beautiful sunny day. And I thought, why has it taken me almost half a century to discover the simple delight of just taking your clothes off and going skinny dipping and swimming and lying in the sun and so on. And so I became fascinated by that. And then over the coming years, over the next few years, I became intrigued. And I think, there were probably a number of steps that led towards writing the book. Another key step was going on a long walk, coming to the top of a hill, an old Iron Age fort, feeling very hot, looking around and starting to take my clothes off just to enjoy the spot, and wondering if it was illegal to do that. I suddenly thought, well, this is very strange. if somehow by just being myself with nothing on top of me, I am somehow breaking the law. So this kind of existential strangeness of that idea came upon me suddenly, and I decided to, start exploring it more seriously.
So this book you've written, I guess in some ways you've become a naturist, but you're not a naturist first. Even though this book is really something which would be could have been written by a naturist and is of great interest to naturists. So, who are you first? What are you? You say, are you a druid? Is that what you call yourself?
Well, I anytime one tries to describe oneself or to use a label, immediately I sense myself feeling limited. It's a bit like putting on clothing, isn't it?
Yes,
So you can
yes.
say that I'm male, or I'm white, or I'm middle class, or I'm English, and they're all true. Those statements are all true. But as soon as I say them, I feel slightly restricted. So I would say, first of all, I'm human. That's the main thing, I guess. And although some people, I suppose, might doubt that sometimes, my wife in particular, uh, but but I have become a naturist. But I would sort of wear the label lightly. I'm a druid. That's the sort of spiritual path that I follow. But I'm also interested in all sorts of other paths. And I even find calling myself just a druid is a limiting kind of label.
Well,
But I
but
suppose,
you're not just a druid. You founded a druid organization in which you lead, haven't you?
well, that's right. And well, my teacher, whose biography I wrote, Ross Nichols, he founded the order back in 1964, and I was asked to lead it in 1988. So I didn't found it, but I'm leading it now. I've been leading it for the last 20 years. Yes.
And so, for a lot of our listeners are naturists, but probably don't know much about Druidism. What is Druidism? Is that the correct term, Druidism?
Yeah, Druidism or Druidry. Well, of course, Druidry and Naturism go very well together. And we have a section on our website called Druidry and Naturism, because Druidry is really a spiritual path for people who feel that being out in nature is their way of meeting God or the goddess, or being at one, or taking the path to enlightenment. So it's a spiritual way. It's inspired by the old pre-Christian religion of the Druids that came from the northwestern Europe way back, and it experienced a revival about 300 years ago when people started to explore their roots in this part of the world. And today, it appeals to people who are spiritual by nature, but who generally find the established religions a little too restrictive or not quite answering their needs. And so one of the things that interested me about nakedness in general is the spiritual component in that. So as you'll know from my book, a third of the book deals with the spiritual component of being naked. And it's all about, I guess, Druidism, is about getting closer to the natural world and coming to hear the song of the river and of the stars and of the trees and so on. And so we have different ways of doing that. We have meditations and we have ceremonies and festivals to get in tune with the rhythm of the seasons. And there's a strong stress on what's called the bardic arts, the arts of storytelling and music and poetry. And all of this, as I said, goes well with the theme of naturism, being natural.
It does. I've always said that I feel closer to God when I'm nude in nature than when I'm wearing a suit and tie in a church. That feels very artificial. Whereas it's almost like you can sense God when you're in nature. What God is depends, I guess, on your beliefs.
Exactly. There's a great quote that I managed to get into the book from Dolly Parton, who said, "I feel closest to God when I'm at the bottom of my garden, naked, running naked along the by the stream or something," which is exactly it. And there is this concept of that you have in Christianity called standing naked before God, nothing in the way, just you and the divine, however you experience that. And of course, what I discovered very quickly was that in virtually every religious approach, some people have discovered what Dolly Parton, you and I, and other people have discovered, which is that it's a way of feeling closer to whatever this, nameless reality is that we might call God or the divine. Or
Yeah, I really enjoy that about the book. Actually, is that it's not a book about religion or about Druidry for that matter, but it does touch, as you say, I guess about a third of it, on how many religions actually have nudity, if not currently in their history, as a component of their beliefs. I was quite amazed.
well, it's interesting. If you look at religious behavior, you see how people, since time began, people have tried to find ways to gain enlightenment, salvation, get close to God, however you want to term it, to change their consciousness. And they found all sorts of ways to do it, like meditation, like ritual, like ingesting hallucinogenic substances, like fasting, like chanting, like spinning round and round like whirling dervishes. So they've tried all these different technologies or ways. And there's actually one way that is very, very simple, which is simply being naked in nature, that people don't really know about that much unless they're in the know, unless they have discovered it themselves or are members of a religious group that use nakedness in a religious context. So that's what fascinated me, that this very sort of simple method in a way that is, isn't dangerous, isn't harmful to your health, can lead to precisely the same goals.
Now, the book is obviously very well researched. Lots of excellent images and photographs as well that really illustrates your point, and which I think is important in a situation like this, because you can talk about it, but visually seeing the nudity in all those contexts adds, as they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Absolutely.
What you must have done a lot of work to put this book together. And how did you manage to do that? I mean, given that Druidry is sort of your main focus, how did you manage to find the time to put so much into this book?
Well, the book, I guess, took about 9 years to create. And there's a particular kind of technique that I've developed over the years with the books I've done, whereas I get an idea for a book, and I open a file on my computer, and I open a physical file in my filing cabinet, and I start to gather stuff like a magpie, and I talk to friends about it, and when I've got an hour free, I'll roam the net and look for things, and gradually the material just comes in, and you know how time flies,
Yeah.
and suddenly it's 4 years on, and you've got a whopping great file of material. And and then slowly a kind of structure starts to coalesce. And for me, it was looking, the book looks at nakedness in religion, then it looks at it in politics, and then it looks at it in popular culture. There's these sort of three areas which are very rich and fertile fields.
Mm-hmm.
And so a kind of structure develops. And then the actual writing, I kind of worked very fast to do this. So the writing took about a year, and I found a fantastic publisher who was very keen on the idea and supported me and so on. And so I took a year of actual writing, but behind that year is sort of 8 years, 9 years of research, that's built towards it.
Well, that's quite an enterprise. Especially since if a naturist had written this book, they would have probably started with already a fair amount of material and knowing where to get some of it, but it was all new to you.
Well, yes. Well, what I did is, 10 years ago, when I discovered Spielplatz and I discovered how pleasant it was, I got myself a little chalet there, and I used that as a writing chalet. So, and I joined the British Naturist movement and British Naturism, and I subscribed to a couple of naturist magazines, one in the States. And then Carl Jung, the great psychologist, talked about how when you're working on a particular subject, how a whole sort of host of synchronicities seem to occur. So, for instance, one of the big synchronicities that occurred with this is once I decided to work on this book and start gathering material, my next door neighbor came up to me one day as I was standing outside the house and said, "Oh, look, I'm throwing away a whole load of Naturist magazines. We discovered that we were Naturists and that he was in his late 80s by then. I discovered a few months before that he was a Naturist. And he said to me, I'm throwing away these old magazines. And he had a complete archive of the very earliest copies of the Sunbathing Review from the 1930s. He had a copy of the Canadian Federation early magazines from the 1940s, I guess. So suddenly I had this instant archive of Naturist magazines from way back. And of course, we're terribly blessed these days. You can go on to abe.com and American Book Exchange and Amazon, and you can just get secondhand books. So I quickly built up a collection of secondhand books stretching way back into the 1930s as well on naturism. And I was helped hugely by C.E.C. Cinder's book on the history of naturism, a great tome which is very comprehensive, which studies the history of naturism and so on. So I was able to gather quite an archive of material quite quickly. And I was also able to work at it in a naturist resort with a tremendous history as well. And the daughters of the founder still live there, and they were able to take me through all their old photo archive and to talk about the early days and so on.
Well, I actually interviewed Cease Cinder for an earlier podcast, and he has probably one of the most comprehensive libraries of naturist material in the world, from the sounds of it, yet not a public one. And,
he was tremendously helpful to me. For instance, when he heard I was working on the book, he just sent me the entire set of the back issues of Free Beach News, for instance, which is a magazine that he'd edited in the States and so on. So I had a lot of material, and I've spent a lot of time out in New Zealand, and so I wrote quite a bit of this book out in New Zealand. I stayed at a naturist resort out there in Katikati, and was able to study naturism in New Zealand. And there's a couple of books. There's a book on Canadian naturism that I've got here, Au Naturel. There's a book on Australian nudism produced by an academic in Australia. There's a lot of interesting resource material out there for anybody who wants to study this.
Yeah. And so one question I had, on two occasions in the book, at the very beginning and about halfway through, you talk about nudism being on the decline since the 1960s. Do you mean that as distinct from naturism, or are you using the two terms interchangeably?
Well, what I meant by that is, I think I qualified it by saying social nudism or social naturism. What I mean by that is as far as I understand, what happened was, with the history of naturism, that it reached its peak in about the 1950s. So we probably all know the story of how in Europe it developed out of the really the Lebensreform, the life reform movements in Germany, the fantastic cures that were being developed for TB, using nudism as a way of getting fresh air and light to people and so on. And so with the health benefits, and then the development of clubs that brought people together, reached their peak in the 50s. And then what we had the advent of cheap air travel, package holidays, and people who lived in Europe certainly found that because of the vagaries of the weather, that they could travel abroad and get their kind of dose of sunshine in naturist resorts in France and Italy and Greece and so on, where there was a long tradition of naturism. And club life began to decline. And I'm sure there are other factors as well, just changing social patterns, the way, people have found that. For instance, I was talking to somebody in France about the decline in social activity in French villages, where there was always the bar, for instance, where people would go and hang out in the bar tabac, and would smoke and drink and chat. And of course, television has killed that. Television in the supermarket, because you buy the booze more cheaply in the supermarket, and you stay at home and watch the television. And now you can't smoke in these places because it's illegal and you have to go outside. And same thing in Britain, the pub, the world of the pub has been hugely affected because people can't smoke in pubs anymore. And alcohol is much cheaper in supermarkets. So you have these broad sort of social trends. So a combination of them, I think, has meant that social club naturism has declined. Has that applied in Canada as well?
Well, I was going to say I don't fully agree with that conclusion, but again, it depends on how you define the terms and what you're looking for. I think, I've also read a number of the old books, and I love, as you say, it's wonderful how you can get among the Nudist, a 1931 edition. I bought it for $20, and I had it in a week, whereas it would have been impossible. I would have been searching for years, old bookstores, trying to find it before the internet.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think what you were seeing there at that time is there was this. It was pre-antibiotics, and that the sun was this wonderful cure for the health, the very health problems, the very real diseases that they had. And once you had antibiotics, it was no longer as urgent. And the work of Adolf Koch with the schools and to have healthy kids, I think a lot of that went by the wayside. But in terms of membership in organizations like British Naturism, AANR in the U.S., the Federation of Canadian Naturists, there was kind of growth through the 80s.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, in terms of membership and circulation of magazines, there was a continuous growth. The big boom seems to be, at least in North America, was in the 60s and early 70s, but it was all very mixed up with sexual revolution. And
don't you think that, obviously to really know, we'd have to look at all the statistics of membership of clubs and so on over the years. But what I suspect is that more people are perhaps practicing naturism out in nature on their own, going to free beaches and naturist beaches and skinny dipping or just not bothering to wear clothes at home when it's warm and so on.
Yes.
But actually being members of clubs and spending their weekends at clubs, I suspect has declined, has it not?
It hasn't, and it's certainly widely reported that it has. There's no question what has definitely declined is membership in organizations because it's no longer necessary. You can go and find a resort or a club or a vacation destination, a naturist one, through the internet, and none of them require membership in an organization anymore before you're admitted. So there's no question that kind of membership has gone down. And you're also right. I don't see any decline in the number of people who attend beaches like Red Beach in Vancouver. And Hanlon's Point, which is a nude beach in Toronto, was designated in 1999 and has had a fairly steady growth in attendance ever since. So it's less organized, absolutely. I think part of the mix-up that we've had, though, is this whole sexual liberation and naturism and nudism. I kind of coined a few months ago the term because people mix up naturism and nudism. In the United States, it tends to be more nudism. In Europe, it tends to be more naturism. And yet often the people mean the same thing when they're in the way they practice it. So I've talked about ethical naturism versus recreational naturism.
Say more about that. That sounds a nice distinction.
Yeah, well, it's because I've discovered that there is a clear difference in what people want. There are a lot of people that seek the ethical naturism, where it's not just taking your clothes off. The recreational nudist or naturist, it's more an option to wearing a bathing suit at the lowest level of recreational naturist and nudist. Like everything, I consider it to be a scale. But I certainly see people who just don't like to wear a bathing suit, and it means nothing beyond that. And in fact, they are very happy to be dressed in between. The far end is the recreational naturist or nudist who believes that it can make the world a better place, that it promotes equality and health, and there's a spirituality to it, and you feel closer to nature. And that side, I think, has disappeared a lot. I think I've seen a lot of clubs and you could tell me about Spielplatz, but I've seen a lot of old clubs that have evolved away from their spiritual naturism or the ethical naturism into a very banal, simple recreational naturism.
Right. That's interesting, isn't it? I don't have, enough experience of clubs to be able to say that. If that's so, that's a shame. I know exactly the distinction you're making, and I think what interests me is that ethical end of it, where it's an experience that's leading one closer to nature, to respect nature more, to be to treat each other with greater respect, and so on. As opposed to just a sort of hedonistic enjoyment. I mean, which is, there's nothing wrong with that either. I don't want to sound like a Puritan, but I just think that naturism has the potential for being so much more. I mean, what I'm finding is in my I travel around and I do lots of work with groups and so on. And recently we had a healing retreat at Spielplatz with about 20 people who came along, and I think what is heartening is to see that there are many people who do understand the ethical and spiritual dimension of it. This may be just because that's the world I move in; those are the kind of circles I move in. But I think again, in which is why I focused on it, for a third of the book, is that when you start to explore that field, you see that there are increasing numbers of people who are aware of the fact that naturism can bring them some spiritual benefits, as well as more simpler hedonistic benefits, if you like.
Well, do you think in your research that Spielplatz has as strong of a view of the idealism of naturism than 40 years ago?
Probably not. I think if you look in any movement, it goes through cycles. It's just like the seasons, And I think, perhaps the summertime of the organized social nudist movement was the 1950s. And it's been going into a kind of autumn and sort of is now in a kind of wintry period. What I hope will happen is that there will be a kind of rebirth, a new cycle that the naturist world will go into as more people experience the spiritual benefits of naturism. And I think whilst that may not happen, I think it may possibly happen because we're undergoing this, crisis where suddenly the natural world is under threat and more people are realizing that. And, it's the old story is you only really value something when you risk losing it. And as people wake up to the fact that they might lose a lot of the beauty that exists in this world, what I hope is that people will become more environmentally aware, more responsible environmentally, and they will seek, and what we're certainly seeing in the Druid movement is we're having every year more and more people join our movement and start studying Druidism because they want to cherish the earth and get back to it. And one of the ways you can do that is by being naked outside in nature and connecting with Mother Earth. So that's what I hope for.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I also own a naturist club, my wife and I do, called Bare Oaks Family Naturist Park, which we took over 5 years. It'd been around since 1972.
Yeah.
It had very few members, 136, I think it was. Yeah. We're well over 500 now.
Oh, wow.
Plus, we get thousands of visits every summer from non-members because we do not force membership on people.
Right.
And I think, and a lot of young people who've never tried naturism before, we're not taking from other clubs. And in my philosophy when I started, which seems to be proven right, was that you need some place that means something. You need a very strong ethical background. And the example I give is if you went to a vegetarian restaurant because you were a vegetarian and passionate about vegetarianism, and you found on the menu that they had steak, you'd be very disappointed. You expect a restaurant that has the philosophy to have a stronger belief than you do. And similarly, when you go to church, if you went to church and found that the priest or minister or leader somehow was less passionate about the religion than you are, you would equally be disappointed. You expect these destinations to be beyond where you are so that you can learn and you can completely bathe yourself in this philosophy. And which is why I have the podcast, which is why we try to really make it more than just taking your clothes off.
How fantastic.
Well, thank you. I think that the big where we all went wrong as a movement is trying to be mainstream. And my listeners are going to roll their eyes when I say this because I keep saying it. One of the biggest mistakes was being clothing optional.
Oh, really? Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Yes. So your place isn't the clothing optional?
No, because I mean, I have a whole show where I just explain the reasons and a web page and all that. But essentially, we water it down. That's like offering hamburger in the vegetarian restaurant.
Yeah.
You either come for the philosophy or you don't. And if you are clothing optional, it was with the idea of being inclusive. But in being inclusive, we watered down what we were all about.
Well, I can understand that. I went to a naturist place in New Zealand once, which had become clothing optional. And I found it really difficult. I turned up there and everybody seemed to be clothed. So, of course, it's really hard to take your clothes off in that kind of environment with everybody there. And so I can see that point. But how wonderful that you've seen this trend, your membership going up. I think that's fantastic. That's really good news. And do you feel that this more ethical, if you like, spiritual, or however you want to term it, idealistic approach to naturism is that what you're working with in your resort?
Absolutely, and I think that's what people want. That's why they first flocked to naturism. They were, and it's even more relevant today. In a world where we tell people that they're supposed to expose their body for the pleasure of others, not for themselves. And at the same time, we also tell them that their body is not good enough to do that.
Yes.
I mean, it's warped. And then we're throwing in now for the last decade or so, social networking, where our connection with people has become so artificial that we don't know that the person on the other end of your Facebook is 16 or 50, male or female, in the UK or in China. Really, they tell you things, but you don't know.
You don't know if it's true. Yeah, exactly. And one of the points I hope my book gets across is that that what you don't accept, what you reject, actually controls you. It's a kind of psychological law. What you repress, what you deny, has some controlling effect on you. And so if you can just accept your skin, who you are, you can then let go of it. You then don't have to be obsessed by your appearance. You don't have to be hung up about how you look. And there's a great key. So people think, I think, from the outside, people think that naturists or, me writing this book about it must be obsessed by nakedness and by the body. But in fact, it's actually quite the reverse. I think once you can actually own it and be comfortable with it, then you can let go of it as a kind of controlling factor in your life. It's a kind of subtlety that some people don't appreciate, I think.
Yes, well, it's true. Well, first, I often say that naturism is not about nudity. It's about acceptance of self, of others, and getting closer to the environment. Nudity is just that tool, very important tool to get there. Yeah. And people say, I've accused me of being, obsessed with being naked. I said, well, that's not really true because I'm dressed most of the time when somebody's talking to me about that. Yeah. And I say, I'm just as comfortable dressed talking to you, but let's go and take our clothes off and see who's the one who's obsessed.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Yes. I said I was interviewed a lady when the book came out. It got a lot of publicity, and one lady rang up from the Times, I think it was, and she said to me, aren't you making a lot of fuss about something that is really just it's not a big deal anymore? So I said to her, well, are you standing in an office now? And she said, yes. And I said, well, if it's not a big deal, why don't you take your clothes off and carry on talking to me? And and straight away, and she said, well, I couldn't do that. And I said, well, so you see, it still is a big deal. Even if you were really hot and you wanted to do that, you couldn't. in your office at the moment, you know. Well, you could, of course, that's the secret, but you could.
Yes.
But it would be a big deal for you and everybody in the room. So she got my point straight away.
So that's actually a very nice segue into one of the other questions I wanted to ask. What kind of reaction did you get to the book?
Well, it was interesting. You know, I've been writing books for 20 years now. And of course, I suppose, inevitably, this got the most publicity. And it got so many reviews. It got reviewed twice in the same papers. I remember sitting in a motorway cafe after all the flurry of reviews had come out, opening my copy of The Independent on Sunday, starting to look through the book reviews and feeling a bit just thinking, well, I won't be able to enjoy seeing the excitement of seeing a review of my own book anymore, because this has been reviewed in The Independent already. And I opened it, and there was another review, you know, again in the same paper. But the greatest favor was done to me by a furious review. It was reviewed on Friday in the Telegraph by an English Don from Cambridge, and he gave it a fabulous review, really lovely review. And then on Sunday, another English Don, again from Cambridge, from a different university, reviewed it. And it was extraordinary. It was by a guy called Peter Conrad, and he just laid into me personally, it was strangely enough, saying I was, for some reason, he decided that from looking at the photograph of my face on the back, that I was obviously fat, and it was bizarre. And he was absolutely furious. And it was such a strange review. It started going onto people's blogs saying, have you read this review that is so vicious and vitriolic? And I got phoned up the next week by the Wellcome Foundation, which is a huge medical foundation in the UK, asking me to speak at their conference called Skin Exposed, which they spent a day talking about nakedness, and they got British Naturism to come along. They had an exhibition on skin in their sort of medical museum, and they had a geneticist talking about, you know, why our bodies are relatively hairless. They had some poetry, and I gave a talk there. And then I got telephoned by the Lowry Gallery, where they were having a Spencer Tunick exhibition, and they got me to go and speak up there. So I got a lot of great publicity from this one negative review. So all in all, it's been and I got a couple of BBC radio interviews from it. So it's had a lot of publicity, which has been, you know, really heartening, because sometimes you can write a book, it can be published, and you don't get a single review, nothing happens. So this was in some nice big, you know, doubled page spreads in the Sunday papers, you know. So it's been fun.
So where there is negative reviews, because I'm a little puzzled, because your book is very much factual. So I'm what kind of negative review could you get?
Well, he said his criticism was too much information. You know, there's a section in my book where I talk about shaving pubic hair, because this is something that, you know, 20 years ago was kind of confined to you know, I don't know, the personal columns or letters pages of Forum magazine or something like that. But in recent times, it's become the subject of Remington shaver ads. There's an Irish cosmetic company that did a video based on that idea. People like Elton John talk about it and so on. So it's kind of out of the closet and people talk about it. But he found that very distasteful. And I'm not quite sure why he was so excited about it, but it made him angry. It touched a nerve, I think. And I think he embarrassed himself, because when you looked at the review online, you saw dozens of people commenting on him and what his hang-up was. So he was kind of out of step with the zeitgeist, I think, definitely there. But and it was the only negative review. I mean, I all the other reviews have been great. Have been absolutely great, including reviews in academic publications. You know, there was a lady called Ruth Barkhan who wrote a academic book called Nudity, and she wrote a review for a sociology journal about it, which was very positive and so on. Yes, so I think his was the only negative review.
Yes, you referenced Ruth a few times. You seem to enjoy her book quite a bit. Did you get the very positive reaction and support from the Naturist movement?
Yes. I got nice reviews from British Naturism and in Health and Efficiency, so that was nice. And I gave a talk at Speelplatz, and I just today I was invited to talk at British Naturism's weekend at Alton Towers in November, which I'll try and get to. So yeah.
Very good. So what's next? Are you going to continue with your interest in naturism and nudity? Any more books?
I think probably what I want to do. There's an interesting phenomenon that I've noticed occurs when I write a book. What happens is I spend some years researching, then I write it, then it's published, and then I give talks about it or workshops in some cases. And what happens in the course of the talks and the workshops and discussing it with people and reading reviews and getting feedback and so on, I then develop my ideas. Not sufficiently, I think, to do another whole book, but one of my little projects is to write an essay about each of the books that I've written over the last 20 years as a kind of catch-up, as a kind of postscript. And so I've got about halfway with writing the postscript to A Brief History of Nakedness, which I'll probably put up on the net. I think that's probably the best way to do it. Kind of conclusions and some more material that I've uncovered, and so on, and maybe some little personal anecdotes. For instance, Spencer Tunick, of course, who I wrote about in the book. About 6 months after the book came out, I was invited to a private Spencer Tunick shoot, which is like a private party in Oxford, where about 25 of us met up, and he did a shoot for us, and then gave us a set of, gave us each a print, a signed print as a result of that, and that was tremendous fun. That was a great experience, a great evening, and so on. So I think I'll write a maybe 10,000 words on that and put it up on the net, and try and gradually work through all the books that I've written and do a similar kind of job. But I don't think I've got enough material for another whole book on it.
So that's all for this episode of the Naturist Living Show. Thank you so much for listening. You'll find links to the books that I've talked about and all the websites and items that I mentioned on the show website in the show notes. And the website is located at naturistliving.bareoaks.ca. That's B-A-R-E, of course, bareoaks.ca, because we're in Canada. Keep sending your emails and your notes and your suggestions. I always love to read them. And I think I respond to everyone, but of course I can't read all these anymore on the show. There's just not enough time. But keep sending me the notes, because I do enjoy it. It keeps me going, and it's good to get the feedback. The email address for the show is naturistliving, all one word, at bareoaks.ca. B-A-R-E, bareoaks.ca. Join us again in about a month for the next episode of the Naturist Living Show.
This episode of the Naturist Living Show was brought to you by Bare Oaks Family Naturist Park. Traditional naturist values in a modern setting. Traditional values means that naturism is more than just taking your clothes off. It is a life philosophy with physical, psychological, environmental, social, and moral benefits. Bare Oaks Family Naturist Park strives to promote those naturist values in a modern setting that provides the amenities and services that our members and visitors expect. Free your body, free your mind. Learn more at www.bareoaks.ca.